As the United States government prepared itself for doomsday and ensured its own survival in the weeks prior to the Great War, the US Army garrison stationed at Mariposa military base staged a revolt against the facility's scientists upon learning the horrific truth about the base's cruel FEV human experiments. Safe inside the base as the world collapsed around them, these soldiers and their families would soon form a new closed society for themselves in the New California wasteland, devoting their lives to the mission of preserving and hoarding all advanced technology and regulating its reintroduction to the wasteland so that humanity would never repeat its mistakes that had doomed the old world. Meanwhile, another faction would emerge in New California with an entirely different and more sinister view on how to rebuild society. In this video, we shall be discussing the early history of the Brotherhood of Steel, as well as the origins of the Master and the Unity. The Brotherhood of Steel would come to be defined by their use of advanced technology. Luckily for us, we don't have to fight tooth and nail to get such tech, because we can build it. And 9 times out of 10 that's going to involve some software engineering, which is why we should introduce you to our sponsor, boot.dev. It's an online training camp for learning employable programming skills, especially back-end web development, a very lucrative field, with salaries over $100,000 in the US. It's that high because not that many people get through the rigors of learning to do it. But with boot.dev, that's not going to be a problem. Starting from the very beginning, boot.dev provides detailed instructions on everything you need to know and gets you writing as much code as possible, delivering projects and exercising your creativity, as that's the only way to really learn this field. You take it at your own pace, with game-like questions and incentives to keep learning new things. With all their guidance and resources, in about a year of part-time use, you'll be a master of the Python and Go programming languages, and from there the world of software creation is yours to explore, no university bills required. There's a free demo of all their courses and features, and there's a 30-day no questions asked refund period, so it's definitely worth a look if you think this is the direction you want to take. But before you go, click our link in the description and use our code Wizards and Warriors to get 25% off your first payment, for either a month or year of access depending on what you prefer. Go check it out. On January 7th, 2077, work on the forced evolutionary virus was transferred from the West-Tec research facility outside San Diego to the Mariposa military base in central California. Concurrently, a US Army garrison was detailed to the base to protect the scientists and secure their research from Chinese agents and espionage leaks. This garrison was commanded by Colonel Robert Spindle and his executive officer, Captain Roger Maxson. These soldiers, under Spindle's and Maxson's command, moved to the base with their families, and soon a regular security detail was arranged, with the garrison completely oblivious to the knowledge that the scientists at Mariposa were performing experiments on live human test subjects. Mariposa's dark secret wasn't able to be kept hidden from the garrison for long. After guarding the FEV research labs for over 10 months, on October 10, 2077, the soldiers learned the horrible truth about the mission of the scientists they were sworn to protect, and the twisted human experiments they were undertaking inside the base. They even learned that many of the test subjects for FEV were military prisoners of war. Overwhelmed by the awful revelation surrounding their mission, Colonel Spindle locked himself inside his office as his troops desired justice and the scientists' heads. Eventually, the colonel suffered a nervous breakdown, forcing the garrison to look towards his XO, Captain Maxson, for leadership and guidance in their moment of crisis. Captain Roger Maxson now found himself in the unenviable position of leading an army garrison craving the blood of the base's scientists, and who were becoming more and more aggressive with each passing day. The base scientists were detained by Maxson's men and locked up for interrogation. Captain Maxson had to be diligent in keeping an eye on both the detained researchers and his own vengeful troops. Desiring to interrogate his prisoners for more information on Mariposa and the FEV, Maxson had to prevent one of his impulsive soldiers from executing the scientists on the spot. Soon, the captain began questioning the scientists, starting with the FEV project's chief researcher, Robert Anderson. Anderson explained to Maxson that the human testing at Mariposa military base was completely sanctioned by the federal government in Washington, and was even ordered by the government to be undertaken. As Anderson outlined each of the FEV experiments to Maxson, the stunned captain refused to believe that the government he had sworn to defend would sanction such inhumane experiments on American citizens. Maxson was in disbelief and asserted that Anderson and all his researchers were immoral monsters. Losing control, Anderson began shouting at Maxson that he and his men were simply following orders, and that they were soldiers just like the captain and his garrison. Having heard enough, and enraged at being compared to the scientists, Maxson executed Anderson right then and there. Having just murdered his superior officer, Maxson realized he and his men were now in open rebellion against the United States government, whether they liked it or not. On October 15th, Colonel Spindell committed suicide, just as Maxson and his men broke into his office, making Maxson the unquestioned leader of the rebellious army garrison. Within days of Spindell's suicide, Maxson and his men had executed most of the Mariposa research team. One of the last scientists to be executed continues to assert to the captain and his men that the government had indeed sanctioned their mission at Mariposa, shaking Maxson and his troops to their very core. Wishing to get an official response from the government, and with it some answers, Captain Maxson issued a radio broadcast on October 20th, declaring that his unit at Mariposa Military Base was now in open secession from the United States. In his personal journal that evening, Maxson mused how Confederate President Jefferson Davis had become vilified for leading the secessionist Southern states in the American Civil War, and pondered what his own legacy would now be. Much to Maxson's surprise, as the days passed by, there was no reply from their former superiors, or even any news from Washington. Maxson sensed that something had to be wrong in the outside world for the federal government to completely ignore an openly rebellious military unit, and so on the 21st, he ordered the garrison's families to relocate to the fortified military base for shelter. 2 days later, on October 23, 2077, the Great War began. Maxson and his group were now on their own. Safely sheltered inside the underground and fortified Mariposa military base, Captain Maxson and his people weathered the storm of World War raging outside. However, the captain continued to harbour concerns that the Chinese would soon launch missiles at Mariposa, and the next day ordered his soldiers and their families to prepare to vacate the facility. With the nuclear fallout settling outside, one of Maxson's men, Sergeant Platner, volunteered to venture outside in his T-51B power armor and get an atmospheric reading. He returned to the base, reporting that the radiation outside was at relatively safe levels, and so Maxson and his men began final preparations to leave the base and journey outside for an event that would become known as the Exodus. Maxson ordered the scientists buried outside the base, and on October 27th, the captain, his former US Army servicemen, and their families all set out from Mariposa to begin the exodus through the nuclear wasteland of New California, with their destination being a large underground government bunker and storehouse to the southeast, known as Lost Hills. Before departing, Maxson activated the base's security robots to prevent anyone from stumbling on the facility. For weeks, Maxson and his retinue traveled through the hostile wastelands of New California, suffering casualties from radiation as well as aggressive mutants and roaming marauders. Tragically, one of the casualties was Roger Maxson's wife. The group suffered a further loss when a section of power-armored troops under Sergeant Allen, ignoring warnings from Captain Maxson, broke away from the main caravan to venture even further southeast and explore the ruins of the vault-tec research facility in search of advanced technologies. This breakaway faction under Sergeant Allen would never be heard from again. After weeks of travel, Maxson's caravan finally arrived at the Lost Hills bunker sometime in November. Maxson and his men soon occupied the bunker, and before long the facility was fully operational, becoming a bastion of technology in the hellish wasteland. Maxson used the base's functioning satellite uplink to contact other army units across the shattered country, eventually establishing communications with a former military unit operating in the wastelands of Appalachia in West Virginia, led by Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty, an old acquaintance of Maxson's. Years passed by, and as the population of Lost Hills bunker steadily increased, Maxson's little community became a bastion of advanced technology in New California. It was during this time that Maxson began to envision a new future for his people and the post-apocalyptic world around them. In 2082, Roger Maxson issued a proclamation to the people of Lost Hills and to the other units his satellite uplink had contacted. The United States had failed in its mission to protect the American people and serve their needs before the Great War. Now Maxson and his people would form a new society, the Brotherhood of Steel. Their order would be dedicated to the mission of preserving all advanced technology, preventing it from falling into the wrong hands, and preventing another tragedy like the Great War from ever being repeated again. The Brotherhood of Steel was organized into a hierarchical societal order, divided between the scribes, whose mission was to study and catalog advanced tech, the knights, who would seek out advanced technologies in the wasteland, and the paladins, the order's power-armored warriors, who would protect the Brotherhood from any threats. The Brotherhood at Lost Hills would be led by a council of elders, with the High Elder, the first being Roger Maxson, leading the entire order. In the years after the Brotherhood of Steel's founding in 2082, the Brotherhood dedicated itself to protecting the people of the wasteland outside Lost Hills. Roger Maxson, now styling himself as High Elder Maxson, believed in keeping the Brotherhood open to outsiders, ideals which soon clashed with those members of the Order who sought to keep themselves in a closed society, preventing Wastelanders from joining their ranks. High Elder Maxson continued to lead the Brotherhood of Steel's main chapter at the Lost Hills bunker for many years after the founding of the Order. In 2135, Elder Maxson died of cancer, leaving a lasting legacy not just in the Brotherhood of Steel, but eventually for the entire wasteland. His son, Maxson II, soon succeeded him as High Elder, with Roger's grandson, John Maxson, joining the Paladins and showing great promise as a future leader for the Brotherhood. But while the Brotherhood of Steel was establishing itself in New California in the late 21st and early 22nd centuries, another order was beginning to rise in the wasteland, and its leader, the Master, had a radically different vision for the future of New California and the whole wasteland. The origins of the Master can be traced back to Dr. Richard Moreau, a resident of Vault-8, one of the 17 control vaults. Dr. Moreau was a scientist who dreamed of one day helping the people of the wasteland to rebuild from the Great War. When Vault-8 opened in 2092, and its inhabitants began establishing a small settlement for themselves outside its door with their Garden of Eden creation kit, Dr. Moreau was exiled for the crime of murder. Changing his name to Richard Gray, he travelled south through the wasteland of New California in search of purpose, eventually reaching a growing community known as the Hub, 400 miles south of Vault-8. Here, Gray established a small lab for himself, studying the effects of mutation on the hostile mutants roaming the wastes. Richard Gray soon became popular with the residents of the Hub, especially with a prominent caravan master named Harold. Richard Gray and Harold became acquainted, and Harold eventually came to consider Gray a close friend, a brilliant scientist, and a mindful philosopher. Eventually, Gray and Harold decided to work together to try and locate the source of the wasteland's rapidly evolving mutants, which were a constant threat to Hub caravans like Harold's, who had to hire a large retinue of guards to protect their wares from attack. After Dr. Gray discovered that the mutant source was located somewhere to the north, Harold organized an expedition to shut it down or destroy it, with himself and Gray serving as the expedition's leaders. In the late spring of 2102, their expedition was launched from the Hub, traveling far to the north in search of the mutant source. After weeks of travel, on June 23rd, they arrived outside the abandoned Mariposa military base, which was infested with various types of mutants, as well as an active and formidable robot security detail. The expedition began taking casualties as they fought their way through the halls and sublevels of the military base, battling hordes of mutants and security robots. Only Harold and Gray were able to reach the base's deepest sublevel, where they discovered the green vats of FEV from which the mutants were coming. As the two began walking across a catwalk overlooking the vats, they were suddenly struck by a robot crane arm, which knocked Harold unconscious and caused Gray to fall into one of the vats full of FEV. Harold would later wake up outside in the wasteland, and would eventually suffer from the effects of ghoulification. However, Richard Gray's fate was far worse. For days, Richard Gray floated in the slimy vat of FEV, becoming completely submersed in the chemicals and nearly drowning in the process. Eventually regaining consciousness, Gray managed to drag himself out of the vat, but was in total agony from the extreme amounts of exposure to FEV. For weeks he continued to mutate horrifically, transforming into one of the mutant monsters he had sought to destroy. However, Gray soon noticed that his cognitive and mental capabilities had developed tenfold, and he began solving some of the most complex philosophical questions that came through his tormented mind. The mutant Gray began experimenting with the animals that infested the facility, dipping them in FEV and seeing what would happen. Months passed, and Gray's experiments with the FEV led him to envision a philosophy of unity in the wasteland. He started to believe that the forced evolutionary virus was the only solution for healing humanity and the ravaged wasteland. Continuing to experiment on himself and animals with the FEV, in December of 2102, Gray gained the ability to use his newfound mental and neurological powers to connect to the various computers at Mariposa. He now began to experiment on humans unfortunate enough to wander into the base. In January 2103, Gray's tests on one of his victims led him to realize that the levels of radiation exposure directly affected a subject's successful transformation by the FEV. It was the beginning of Richard Gray's twisted plan for healing the world and helping people, just as he had always wished to do. If everyone was forced to transform into mutants through the forced evolutionary virus, he believed there would be no more cause for conflict between the peoples of the wasteland, and, united, they could potentially even thrive in their new world. His vision for the world would become the basis for a cultist movement known as the Unity. Over the next 30 years, Richard Gray gathered test subjects from the surrounding communities in the wasteland, creating a small force of super mutants through the forced evolutionary virus. By 2130, Gray, now calling himself the Master, had created enough super mutants to start kidnapping human test subjects from caravans traveling through New California. Within 7 years, he had created enough super mutants to sustain mass production, transforming unfortunate humans into super mutants and drafting them into his new army to fulfill the Unity. Decades later, in 2152, the Master recruited an opportunistic human named Morpheus and his doomsday cultists to aid him in his plans for Unity. These cultists, all unaltered humans, would serve the Master as spies throughout New California, becoming known as the Children. These cultists would serve as the public face of the Unity, while the Master continued building up his army of super mutants. 3 years later, in 2155, the Master's army apprehended a caravan originating from the Los Angeles test vault in the ruins of downtown Los Angeles, now known as the LA Boneyard. The Master transferred the headquarters of his operations, as well as his mutated body, from Mariposa to the LA Vault, ordering Morpheus and the Children to renovate the ruined building above into a grand cathedral devoted to the Master and the Unity. Over the next 6 years, the Master, from his new command center underneath the cathedral, would build up a strong presence for the Unity and his super mutant army in the wasteland of New California. By the end of 2161, the final preparations for his grand offensive to take over New California were nearly complete. He would conquer the wasteland and force its inhabitants to transform into super mutants, finally fulfilling his twisted dream for the Unity. It seemed as though nothing would stop the Master and his plans, that is, until an unlikely hero would emerge from Vault 13 to stop his ambitions. That, however, is a story for our next video. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.